To introduce Jonathan Montalbano. He is an industrial designer, a general contractor, founder of the Shop Enterprises Incorporated, and founder of Woodlot too, yeah? Yes, founder and operator of the Woodlot in conjunction with the City of Providence. He is a graduate of RISD Industrial Design in 2016. Jonathan put his design theory into execution, which hopefully many of you will be interested in. His woodlot operation manages urban timber waste that would have traditionally been seen as a drain on city resources and something to be gotten rid of, and turns this waste into a valuable resource, milled lumber and other things, which I'm very excited about. I understand also that you have a focus on education and community building, which is incredibly exciting to me, obviously, as an educator, and also just as I encourage my students that when you do something, there is a multiplier effect, obviously, if you can involve education and community involvement, which as I wrote, will amplify your good ideas and inspire both this generation and upcoming generations. So it is absolutely my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Montalbano back to our stage.
Thank you for having me. And so, standing here today, 10 years out, post-graduation, I don't know if there's any seniors or grad students here about to graduate into the world, but it's very interesting to have this full circle moment, because when I left RISD, I was nowhere close to even having this, even as an ideal in my life. And so it's a very beautiful moment. I want to take it set aside for that. So, Woodlot, she just touched upon kind of the background of that. More specifically, the Woodlot is a partnership with my business and the City of Providence. And within the City of Providence, it's the Parks and Recs Department combined with forestry, which maintains the city canopy. So any, basically, park in this city has trees. That's the crews that are doing all the maintenance. That waste has to go somewhere. Same with the city trees, anything on the sidewalk as well, I'd like to mention, goes into some place. Now, for years, the city did not have a management plan. They had a budget, and it wasn't very efficient or effective. And so that's what we're going to touch upon in the first part of the presentation here. And then kind of where I came in with my background, starting my own business, and had a convergence with the city through some other things that I was doing with them that led to the Woodlot. So we'll get started in terms of what the city was doing initially when I was onboarded. So, my dog couldn't be with me. This is my dog Buddy. He's literally always at the Woodlot with us if you ever want to meet him. So I was a little bummed. He's usually with us every day. So he's going to be with us here on the slides. So yes, very, very rough start to this. This was the city's management plan. Even when I got onboarded, this was about the most organized that I saw it, because I organized that. So when I first got contracted as a partner in this, essentially we had certain stipulations within the contract to meet. Education was one of those things. Had no idea how I was going to execute that, but I smiled and agreed and said, yes, of course. Same with kind of free enterprise. Like, I was free to monetize anything that comes into that lot in pretty much any form possible. And we'll touch upon that. But essentially, this is what they were doing. This is kind of anti-monetization. This is paying to get rid of it, and paying basically twice. Because for a tipping fee at a, let's say, junkyard or landfill, you have to pay that basically by volume or by weight, especially for wood waste. And they do judge it on debris that's carried in with not just trees or brush involved, but if there's concrete and asphalt or metal, they hit you with even more fees. And they were paying twice because they're also hiring a company that transports this to and from sites. And so we could go on with that, but not a very effective system of wood waste management. And so when I got on board, I signed this contract and I showed up, and I could really only devote about a day a week. And they had these residual dumpsters. They said, look, we just got to get these topped off to open up space, get them out of sight. So I had to push all the piles of wood waste that was outside these dumpsters into some forms of piles, and also kind of manage this cumulative debris, which was kind of a mix of everything you can imagine. Old mill beams, concrete, rebar, some loom, some soils, some sand, things like that. But I did my best right off the bat to try to start extracting value from what I had traditionally been doing in my own practice. So setting aside and staging certain logs or certain species for certain outcomes and products. And we'll keep getting into that. So this was all that kind of mixed debris in those piles. Chips, they actually kept very well separated. And in my own practice, privately, I never sold a wood chip in my life. And I was looking at hundreds of yards in the corner of the lot. Had no idea what to do with that either. That's a non-issue now. That was easy. Okay. So one thing I want to touch upon, I'm just going to refer to this as the economy of logistics. I don't know how familiar everybody in this room is with any of those acronyms. Maybe you could pick out a couple. They plague us constantly, most of them. Now, I want to provide that as context because each one of these acronyms represents some form of compliance or safety measures or restrictions or licensing. And this kind of dictates what you can do as a private industry or a public entity. And or I should say, when we're going through this presentation, I'll point out where this is actually important and why it's restrictive to certain situations. So you don't really have to know any of these as of right now, but just know that those are what those represent. So generally the equipment here that you're looking at is what Providence Parks and the Forestry Department uses for their logistics. There's certain budgetary reasons that they stick with these machines, but mainly it's safety and compliance. It's a limited fleet of equipment that they use, and it's not really ideal for forestry management. This, by the way, except for that chipper, which is the orange machine in the bottom there, has really nothing to do with waste management in terms of breaking down stock. These are just more for transport. Now, one thing I'll point out is that this fleet of equipment, so that green truck and even that bucket truck there with the arm on the top of it, which is the basket lift, these are made to be able to operate within city limits. And so you do run into even just weight restrictions, let alone actual size restrictions on these roads. And as an operator of heavy equipment and large vehicles myself, it can be a nightmare getting around, and it is a safety issue. So when you have a large turnover in your municipality or organization, and you're constantly onboarding actual skilled labor, even if that's just drivers, you have to be considerate of the fleet and the equipment that you're running and maintaining. In forestry, by the way, I hope I have the statistic right, you can fact check me, but it is the #1 most dangerous occupation. Second is actually road transport. So it's the perfect combination of danger. And so you do have to have a high degree of competency in this field and in the spectrum of where you exist in it. So they're fairly strapped in terms of what they have, but that's some of the reasons as to why they run that equipment. These would be examples that would be more ideal for logistics, but they don't quite fit the bill in a city like Providence. So you can see these both have a grapple set on top. One that has the body on the back would be much better for loose debris. They could actually separate and stage material and put that in one vehicle, the other one being a log truck where it's good for long sections. But when you're trying to run your enterprise or municipality without these tools, you just have to make do, which often leads to cutting things down to basically how do you just get them off site. And by doing that, it really affects the value and what you can extract from the actual material itself. And a lot of examples of that as well. So this changes over. This is my own practice. And, well, I know how I ended up in my position, but I ended up specializing in very bizarre extractions of all sorts. So I wanted to start with this one. The truck in the field there, you can see the size of that log with me for comparison. The request by the customer was that no heavy equipment can come in. Your truck can come in, nothing else, and I want you to preserve this log as is because we want it milled. This was out in Wellesley, Mass, and it was at this beautiful estate, so you couldn't even like bend a blade of grass. But it's a limitation, so you have to create workarounds, and they're a bit unorthodox. So what I had to do was create basically a gantry with a winch, with the details of that not being that important. But essentially I had to just skid this log on, and it was about like a 5-hour battle to get that onto my trailer. When I got to my shop, I have a crane truck, and I just picked it right off that trailer. So it's kind of this juxtaposition between like how absurd it takes, absurd amount of time it would take to manually get this log out of the field to about the 5 minutes it took to just like strap it off and pick it off my trailer at my shop with the right tools. So this would be something that we run, particularly through my business. These are excavators. There's all kinds of attachments on that front bucket, and I mean, hopefully everybody's familiar enough with these things. There's videos to see them in action. But these, in our practice and at the woodlot, tend to be the most versatile heavy equipment. And it's a massive part of the scale of the operation that we're running down there. And you can think of it as if you were to eliminate this style of equipment or this size of equipment, we're just dead in the water because it's at a capacity physically that you could not manage. Even, it doesn't matter the amount of bodies, you'll never get through the amount of material. or the size. So this is a video. This would be something that the city uses, like a skid steer, but this is a bit less orthodox. And the reason we can do this is because we're all owner-operators in my small world that I run, where if you're a union laborer, you could not be doing that. You're going to get shut right down, you'll get slapped with massive fines. So there's those restrictions in place for good reason. It does keep things much safer in terms of operation. Even that little shot of sawing that log, you can see, we had to actually slice that down to get it to fit into the trailer. And it actually fit the bill for what this customer wanted to get these sections milled into. But to demand that out of a municipality is unreasonable. They're not going to do that degree of extraction or that degree of labor. And then that's actually down a wood lot with an excavator in terms of lifting that up and being able to transport on site and staging material for processing. This would be another use of an excavator with a claw, and so this is for loose debris. And the advantage here is that nothing is getting mixed in, so you have a better sense of organization from the site before it comes into the actual lot. And so this is something that we're actively trying to push the city on working towards, but again, they don't have excavators in their fleet, and so it's much harder if you just have a loading style machine, meaning just a bucket on that front end. So hopefully I'm making the case for specialized equipment produces your logistics and your outcome. And then that influences the next stage, which would be processing the wood. Just as another example of how we personally transport logs. I know black locust, we've been talking about that with a couple people here. That's a load of black locust that actually came out of right outside the city of Johnston. And black locust is actually invasive. So we clear plots with a lot of these invasives, and locust, and I'll show in the presentation, has a lot of uses around the city. And we'll get to that as well. So again, another example of excavators being used for pre-work and logistics, and just to demonstrate kind of the gravity and the scope that these things can actually handle. This is down the woodlot. Now this is our articulating loader, and the advantage here is to be able to work in a very tight space because the whole machine basically bends in half to turn. It doesn't drive like your car or like a backhoe, which the city uses. And it outlifts a lot of the equipment that the city would have in a standard fleet. But you have to consider every time you introduce another machine, you have to both have the back end, somebody can actually service this machine in there, and you need to have an operator who's licensed and experienced to be able to operate these different machines as well. And so again, it's a large demand to ask of a municipality to carry this all in a fleet. They stick to more standardized operations. So instead of having 5 different machines, they'll have 5 of the same machine, essentially. So this is just loading wood chips into the bed. Nothing too special. And one of the last examples here of operating the excavator. Now this is a tub grinding machine, which we'll get into later. But this is essentially the only way to load this style of machine. You could try it with a front-end loader. It's just going to be very difficult to do. You also want to be in an enclosed cab because this machine can kind of fling wood all over the place. And so you have other kind of infrastructure considerations for that as well. But again, just the versatility of an excavator. It's a very hard machine to be on these sites. Point of view. Yep, one last case of this. So this would be a standard chipper. Now this is how we're running our logistics as well. So we're trying to eliminate a lot of the hands-on aspect and using the machines to do more of the work. Again, it's something the city just can't afford to do inside both the environment or the regulatory agencies or the compliance. So hopefully everybody kind of grasps the scale of equipment and the implications of that and kind of some of the restrictions surrounding it. That I kind of already knew up front before I got into this contract, which was formally signed about 3 years ago. I had come up through a background with this kind of equipment in mind, so I already knew kind of the ideals that you would be using, but that didn't solve the back end of like, okay, what do we actually do with all the forms of wood waste? I'm going to kind of go here in order of what's probably most familiar to the audience here, which is going to be sawmilling, and I actually have a couple of examples of what we're using in some of the videos to show you, and again for scale and interest, and so you have a better understanding. But the first one here, this relates to that maple log that I pulled out of that field. This is a Alaskan chainsaw mill. It's a very labor-intensive process. And essentially right here, we have 2 chainsaw heads powering 1 single bar and chain, and you're slicing through a log using some kind of straight edge as a reference. And it's a means to break down large stock that you very much have a hard time handling even with just a machine, let alone being able to process in any other form. And so for this request, we were doing specifically quarter and rift sawn lumber, which is just very specific cuts. But this tooling that we use, I'm about to grab and I'll show you, is kind of an entry-level way to process large stock. Because a chainsaw is a lot more cost-effective than buying an excavator and buying a top-of-the-line bandsaw mill, and then having that all infrastructure. You have to put it on a concrete slab. You might even need a shed to put that tool in. And so a tool like this, I'm going to show you guys, is actually where I got my start in milling. And so it was about 5 years ago that I started, I might be lying, maybe it was about 7 years ago, when I started milling lumber, because I knew you could cut your own lumber. I was looking at the tooling, and it's just out of budget, but I knew you could do it with a chainsaw and a jig. This is an aluminum jig that gets fixed into. The limitation here is that most chainsaws, and I brought my other one just for reference. I'll flip this one up. Are you guys familiar with like CCs? Okay, it's like a power rating essentially for your saw. So this would be rated at 120 cc's, which is like a small motorcycle. Or like people who ride mopeds, right? That's like a 50 cc engine. So there's a lot of power there. You can imagine to be able to chunk out the wood and take the full cut at a time. So this has a capacity, call it around 3 feet in terms of diameter. The one we're running in that video is a 6 foot capacity. So that's why you have one on each end. But just for a reference here, that would be used for milling. I've never had to use a saw like that for a trim tool, but this would be used for climbing. And this is like a 20 cc saw. And this is made to be basically one-armed, and you actually climb with this on your hip. But you can also do carving with this. So when I do a lot of notch work or joinery for certain projects, I will actually pull out this small saw. It's much more ergonomic and easier to handle than this one. That's a very much a specialty tool that only goes out every once in a while. So. But that basically led me into entering the milling world on a small budget that was reasonable, and that took me to where we are, which is kind of interesting. So that's actually what the yield was from that log specifically. And then I provided just the transport back to the site it came out from, and the customer took that cut list in, air dried it himself, and it became millwork and a couple furniture pieces around the estate. There were multiple houses on that property, which was fantastic. So this would be use of one of those trucks that, well, Providence can definitely use. And that was a specialty pickup. So this came out of a middle school and high school in the Middlesex, Mass. And they hired us to, again, mill this large stock. And we did this for their wood shops. They wanted the students to be able to use this wood and create pieces with it. And so for this request, we processed this log. And this is kind of the most exciting stuff. And that's why we're starting there. So when we're doing this, especially with chainsaws, we do have to break that bark down. Yes. But he's known as the foreman. Foreman meaning like site manager. He's always around, always watching. And now for this one, we actually did something a little unorthodox with the sawmill, which is we made a vertical cut because they wanted to do a puck, like a large cookie. And to make a fairly coplanar cut, we wanted to utilize the jig that normally is used in a horizontal axis, and we ended up doing it vertically. And that was kind of the first time we ever tried that for the customer, well, for this job and that customer, and it worked out really well. I'm very happy about that. And then we're back to horizontal milling, and again, just breaking down these large logs into quarter and rift sawn stock. And do people know quarter rift sawn when I'm referencing that? It just has to do with where the cut comes out of the log, and it either creates patterns within the wood due to its like medullary rays. Sometimes the way the actual tree grows, it can expose that in more detail. You also get straight grained on every face instead of like a cathedraling pattern, which would be more familiar with plain or flat sawn, which is just taking a log and just cutting it down. This involves rotating the log or breaking it into quarters and then taking the cuts from there, hence quarter sawing. And then rift sawing is just a different angle of that. So it gets into more technical, but it creates a better outcome for the wood. It's more stable, and it produces more value out of the lumber that you're actually producing. But it does weigh a little more. You don't get all of the log captured inside your boards, so you do end up with a bit of waste. So there's that stack, semi-processed, buddy for scale, foreman. There's that puck. And then this is a bandsaw mill. So this is a much more efficient tool because there's a much smaller kerf to that cut. So a chainsaw takes out about a ½ an inch of wood per pass. So you do have quite a bit of loss, and also the labor involved when you're pushing these large saws. And they're very loud. Obviously we're in hearing protection, but the decibels hurt, I should say, and the vibration hurts your hands. It's not something you'd want to do every day. So a bandsaw mill, even at the lower entry end here, is a commercial mill, but by no means is it something that they're running when they're making like your common framing lumber at scale. But this is much more automated. You can see it tracks back and forth on its own. I mean, you're controlling that. Up and down is automated, so you're not lifting this head up and down. And then you can see, again, the skid steer sitting there as a peripheral kind of auxiliary tool that assists in the actual process there. Now, speaking of peripheral tools, for this particular job, because they wanted those pucks, I brought this into the CNC, and they wanted them surfaced. So coplanar meaning just even to itself, and flat as well. And so that was another kind of new process in terms of what you can do even with pucks of wood, which has its application. People do try to make furniture pieces with these, but you have to be very careful with the curing process because they're end grain, so they rapidly lose moisture, and they tend to just check, meaning crack, and kind of violently explode. I don't mean like literally explode, but months later you'll come back into wherever you're storing them and they're split all apart. So it's very hard to preserve them, and it's not like something where you could do a butterfly joint, like a bow tie, and preserve the check from going any further. And I know these things because I've tried. So it was a fun little process, and it was by request. And in my own process here, which hopefully if we have time I'll get into in detail after, but jobs that come in, especially the more unique they are, gives me the opportunity to test these things out for, like, first time. And it's not so much doing it on somebody else's expense because I'm confident in the outcome, but when you're running your own show, let's say your own business, it's very hard to find your own time for experimentation, even if it produces value on the back end. Even if you know you can monetize it, it's risky. Most of the time you have to be putting in just actual work that's generating income, at least in my circumstance. So that ended up being the yield. The picture there on the right, the buddy again, just for reference. And so that's all quarter and rift sawn. That was a white oak log, and that was fantastic lumber. And they scored because when you're doing custom milling, you would think it would be this kind of massive expense because it's very niche. There's not many sawyers, meaning people who cut logs with chainsaws and bandsaw mills. But compared to the market, you can actually come in much, much cheaper. So if you have a good established relation with a sawyer, they can get you lumber maybe a third of the cost or less of what you would get out in the market. There's variables about that, especially you have to consider drying and curing and whether you're going to have this person, if they have the ability to do that for you. But some people need green lumber for certain applications. So that's something to note as well. Out in the market, there are individuals like me that you can approach, and you can either ask for lumber, they usually have access to logs, or you can have your own and they'll saw them up for you. So we're just going to keep going through some more projects here. This one is specific to Providence. Now this was made with white oak, and the call for the species in the city is either white oak or black locust. And the importance of that is both have exceptional longevity outdoors, even when untreated. So in this sense, I actually just had the logs in stock. We'd come into some, and it just aligned itself. I didn't plan this out, but the city approached me looking to build some benches for the Roger Williams Park Gateway, which is the welcome center. And by request, it was either locust or white oak, and I said, I got some white oak. I can definitely do that for you. And so they have very specific designs outside of just species that you need to follow. But given the timeline, we were working with green lumber, And again, another kind of fun process, real time when you're working. I got to experiment with getting the CNC, getting some joinery going on that, because we had to duplicate these benches, as you'll see in a couple slides. And so we needed a very repeatable, clean process, since this is more of a commercial application versus like an artisan type. And that's basically constrained by the budget. You basically have to be very efficient with your labor and your time and your material use compared to kind of an artisan piece where there's usually a larger budget and you can experiment more, you can work slower, work with your hand, maybe enjoy the process. Not here. This is like a commercial application, bang out 3 benches, get them installed. So it's very intense, so you have to come up with workarounds for that also, honor this material and meet the bill. So there's kind of the build out. I hate this next slide. I have to show you this. Ugh. Oh. That was by the contract. I don't like painting wood. I don't like staining wood. But those are the kind of compromises you need to make. And maybe you don't have to, but I had to. It was in the contract. If you want to do this job and you want to get paid, this is what the call for. So it's what it is. So I provided, again, transport, so the logistics there, and installation on site when they were building out this welcome center. Yeah, great little benches, and not a very complicated process, but you have to have the correct tooling for that. You also have the correct access to the correct materials for that, and most people just don't have a bay of white oak logs hanging around. And so a lot of this is serendipity for me. I'm just in the right place, right time kind of thing, and it's just by pursuing what I'm drawn to, for sure, but there's a lot of convergence here of interest, meeting market demand, and these are kind of the outcomes. So now, this is a project, and this is looping back into the Black Locust. We work with Wonosoquatucket River Watershed Council a lot. And again, they either call for locust or white oak for those same reasons. So recently, we've been doing a lot more locust removals. And locust, I think I touched upon, but it's an invasive species, so there's generally no concerns with getting it out of our ecosystem here. Everybody wants it gone. And it is a challenging wood to work with because of its density. And I do have an example up front here, so you can actually compare these densities. In this application, though, we're making this product that's a permeable paver, and it's essentially either for walkways or patios. And the permeability meaning it can take water and pass through the surface rather than shedding off, which is a growing issue. I know with DOT, they have a lot of constraints on what surface materials that you can apply now for a lot of public areas. And Wonosoquatucket works, well, across Smithfield, Johnston, and Providence, and so they have to manage all these different municipalities, and every municipality or city or town has its own constraints and own demands, and it's unbelievably complicated. But permeability is a big one, and even in Providence, I know at least residentially, certain square footage, a certain percentage of the square footage of your property now has to remain permeable. And so these are products that are coming about because of market demand, and we're doing this in kind of a funky, creative way, utilizing the natural characteristics of just wood, any species, because if you're making an end grain cut, it's literally the end of the log, the butt end, and water can pass through the porosity of the wood itself. But we're using black locust particularly because it'll hold its own structure, because it's a very dense, hard wood, and it does not rot, even in ground contact, for at least a very long time, compared to other species of wood. So, again, you can see we're making these tiled grids, and this is us doing the installation. And it follows, if you've ever walked on any of the brick paver walkways around the city, where you have a base underneath and then they're set into a somewhat soft, permeable top. It's the same exact application, it's just that we're using wood instead of brick. And that is because of the permeability factor. So this is a bit of a iteration, if you will. We're basically prototyping, but it's put right out into the wild. And by the wild, I mean like literally the public. And it's fair game. And that's great for, I think, myself as maker, designer, builder, however you want to refer to me as, because you get to see the ruggedness or the faults of your own creations, and they will show themselves immediately when you put it out to the public. Because any little thing that could be taken advantage of or could go wrong will be, and very immediately. So it doesn't take much turnaround to figure out what to do better next time. And so it's great to work with organizations like that that are willing to kind of put it out there and let you just try that, because that usually does not exist. And Providence has been very good at that, I have to say. Out of its many faults. It's very strong plate. It's like, it's commitment to kind of avant-garde ideas and just letting you do it. I've been amazed by what they've let me personally just do. Because in a lot of ways, there's no official certifications for these types of things. You can have certain registrations, licenses, liability coverages, but there's not this, it's a very niche, I wouldn't even know what to call myself. And so it's very funny when you're applying for these jobs that go out for public bid, and you have to write in like what do you do or who you are, and it's like, I cut wood, I can dig holes, I can move stuff on trucks, I don't know. I know I can do this for you though. And surprisingly that's worked out. So yeah, excuse me, more black locust benches. This was on the very tail end of the budget, literally scrap cutoffs. So these come off the mill when we were dimensioning lumber, and I think these actually came off when we were milling the lumber to make those 3-inch by 3-inch little squares. And they just asked if we could install some benches, and I was like, yeah, I think we've got a couple of little logs laying around, and the carving done on that log there that's footed in the ground was done with that little orange chainsaw, the one that I held with my hand there. Because if you try to go into black locust with hammer and chisel, you'll be there a lifetime by the time you get to shaping. So you have to use something very aggressive, very sharp, and even at that, it's not very much pleasure to be shaping, especially out in the field. More examples. And there's a couple other things that get built around this. This is a rain catch by another sculptor, and that actually collects rainwater that they use to then water the surrounding garden and fields. It's because this is out and away from any public utilities. They don't have water on tap out in the field there. So yeah, they're very committed to very cool, very interesting concepts, and very much a pleasure to work with. So that's more of the complicated end of product and making, but not everything needs to be complicated. And this is kind of growing into the woodlot now, and a little more away from past projects that got me into this type of work. So we had a series of these hollowed out logs. We didn't hollow those out. That's how they came to us. That would actually be very hard to hollow out. But there's a little fact here I want to drop too, because I even just learned this one recently. I've actually known for a while they used to use logs for water, like actual water pipe, sewer pipe, all that. They actually used it for gas too, which is like natural gas that heats all of these buildings as well. Which is wild. That's crazy. Gas is super explosive. Like, it's no joke. So they used to use hollow out logs. So it is a process that can be replicated, but I've seen how they do it, and it's massively labor intensive. So we're not making gas pipes, and we're not making drainage pipe out of these. Instead, I was like, I want to do a little herb garden. I want to brighten up the area down at the woodlot, which is a very industrial type space. I have no green thumb, and I was like, I did a little compost the season before this. I got to use it for something. Got these hollowed out logs. All right, filter fabric on the bottom, fill it with some loam, put compost in, plant some seeds, see what happens. And we actually ended up getting a very good yield of all kinds of herbs. That's a bunch of basil. I did a bunch of different types. Strawberries, and this season I'm going to expand upon that on a small grant that I got from Bloom RI, who wants to see more plantings happen. And again, it was like super non-restrictive. They're like, yeah, when they gave me the money, I said, does it have to be used for something specific? They're like, no, just anything. Plant anything you want. I'm like, oh, hell yeah. Give me a budget, I'll do it. So we're actually going to do more of these. And this is going to be a product this season. So it's funny that we're just obviously cutting to a certain dimension, so there's a bit of labor involved. There's a bit of, logistics and being able to stage this so that you can come and pick this up and understand it as product. But it's nothing like having to get a chainsaw, having to get an excavator, having to get a skid steer, having to get a truck. Things that are product can just be simple. So another product that we do too, and I have samples of all these things, if you want to come play with them at the end, they're all on the front table, but firewood. And firewood started as a byproduct from milling because we have a tremendous amount of cutoffs when you're dimensioning lumber. Or as I mentioned before, when you're quarter or rift sawing lumber, a natural byproduct is just excess wood that can't be made into dimensioned boards. And so it wasn't a preference of mine to start getting into firewood, it was just simply a means to an end. But firewood is a massive market. It's a large industry that people do as their primary product. We're doing it kind of as a peripheral product, and so over the years I've accumulated tooling or made our own tooling. So this is actually custom made to fit as an attachment to that skid steer on pieces of lumber or logs here that are way too big to be able to lift up by hand and process and flip and turn by hand. So you can sit from the actual cab, do your work there. This is another more automated machine as well. And this was bought specifically for those slab cutoffs. So you can see the pieces I'm grabbing aren't actually logs. They almost look like dimension boards. But that's all kind of that scrap wood that comes off the mill. And it's much harder to process in a traditional way on a wood splitter like you would rounds of wood. And so there are tooling in the market that you can purchase. Often you have to kind of tweak them, so you have to be a bit of a fabricator to be able to get it to work the way that you're going to want it to, you're going to need it to. But this is also another tool that we have down at the woodlot for processing that wood waste. So another system of management here is actually, I should say, firewood is measured in volume, very specific volume, and people get very upset if you mess that up on them. Yeah, especially if you're short on the volume. So you have to have a system of management here to be able to accurately measure and inventory what you have access to. And so just simple things. This is actually all milled eastern white pine. We made custom crates, and then we actually store and dry and then sell our firewood from there. And so, funny enough too, I just saw a pile of firewood across the street getting ready for water fire. And I know the guy who owns the primary contract for that. He, for years, been asking if we would help him source the wood, split it, and cure it for him. But they have very specific conditions for their wood, and that's why I wanted to pull this slide. That piece that you see there in my hand is a very specific dimension, roughly 3 inch by 5 inch by 16 inch long. And essentially that's what they're going to use for water fire, meaning they'll reject your firewood if it does not meet that as a constraint, and then moisture content is major as well. So if you ever try to burn wet wood, it's a massive cloud of smoke, or it just will not burn. And so you can't have that, especially for something like water fire. You need a clean, hot burn. It's always going to produce a little bit of smoke, but it has to be dried down to a certain moisture content. And for water fire, I know that they use kilns. So they actually use an electric kiln, which draws a massive amount of energy. Wow. So touching upon sustainability, it's not the way to do it, but whatever. It's got to be done, and there's some kind of budget there, because clearly there's demand. But that's just something to note that you probably never know about firewood, but I got there myself. And I'm like, oh God, interesting. So just more logistics is how we just dump it using a skid steer. We have that volume measured out. It's simple, no counting bucket scoops or anything like that. Pretty straightforward. So that's something we have implemented down at the woodlot as well. This is a bit of a tool that we just bought and tested out, and I have these samples here. So you can see that's a very small, almost limb. And what this machine is doing isn't chipping it into a wood chip, it's actually chopping it into about 5 to 7 inch long sections. And for us, and you'll see this product coming up, we either use this to create biochar because it makes excellent feedstock because it breaks a longer limb down, makes it easier to cook, or we're going to test this because it does bag it during the same process right for you and use this as firewood. So another more residential use, like a backyard burning, just chunk wood. And again, in terms of the waste stream and the variable products that come in, variable pieces that come in of lumber and wood waste, it's just another means to extract the highest amount of value that you can out of these, rather than just simply turning them to wood chips, which we have plenty of down at the woodlot. All right. Ah, there's sound to it, nice. So that's the plasma cutter. So we're going to touch upon biochar, which is this massive niche market, and it's something that currently I'm working with DEM, Rhode Island DEM, Department of Environmental Management, on a grant to scale this up. What you saw me working on there was a prototype for a kiln, which you have to make in order to cook your biochar. And essentially what we're doing here is we're taking organic material, in this case wood waste, and we're creating a distilled, almost pure form of carbon that we're going to, well, in our case, inoculate into compost. So introducing the microbiome into the compost to make it a much more nutrient-dense and healthier soil amendment that you can add in, as well as creating a more erosion-resistant soil. And that's massive. I touched upon permeability. Erosion control, especially along embankments like the Woonasquatucket River, is this huge thing that is very important, and DEM and DOT and all these institutions and organizations are very set on fixing sustainably. And so we'll go over biochar really quick. So right here you have an exterior kiln, so the large outer bin is what you're actually putting your fuel into. And in our case, it's more wood waste, but it's in the form of pallets. Nothing that's been chemically treated, but just raw wood and pallets that get basically broken up on us during the process of our own logistics. And generally, we would never do anything else with but just throw away, because they're, you know, metal embedded wood, so you're not going to sit there pulling out every piece of metal, so you can't send them to a chipper. So we found a great way to be repurposing that for some reason. The inner drum there is the retort chamber, which is actually what you're putting some of that chopped up material into, both so that it fits in there, but also so it cooks through much more evenly. When you're cooking biochar, you do initially get a large amount of smoke before the volatiles start burning off. And so this is at my property in Cumberland. I just happen to have a very large smokestack on this property, and it actually works out beautifully. Again, nothing planned, just kind of hit me that, oh, I actually have the infrastructure to do this. Because in order to do this in Providence, we would have to build a more sophisticated model of this, hence the DAM grant, and working with them to create a burning method that would create less emissions, less smoke. Because if we lit fire to how we process it in Cumberland, the fire department would be definitely showing up on us thinking we're setting something on fire. So essentially, you light the outer ring on fire, and that brings the inner enclosed chamber to a certain temperature where it forces out all of the actual volatiles that are within the wood. So if you're familiar with pine, it's a very common species. It has sap, it has resin. That's considered part of those volatiles. That sap is actually a resin that you can distill down to another form of product that they actually used to use in boat building for water, almost like caulking, essentially. But that pitch is what actually gets cooked out in this process, if you were just using pine for that to create biochar. And I have samples with me too, if you actually want to see this in person. It's very almost glass-like, so when you snap it, if it's a high carbon content, it'll just break in your hand, and it's very dusty. Your hands get very dirty immediately. But in order to mix this into our own compost, we break this down with another prototype that we rigged together. And essentially what you're looking at here, if you could even tell, we're going to feed it into that hopper at the top. It sends it through a machine that chops it into small pieces. It shoots it into a drum that is getting shook by a vibratory motor with a screen. And so it actually gets screened down to a certain size. And generally, the smaller the size, basically a 1/4 inch minus, is what you would want to mix into your compost at a certain ratio to inoculate that properly. That's basically the gist of it. So this is that tub grinder. I don't think this video does it justice. It's a much more violent machine, but as you see in the next clip, I'll just skip to that. You can see this pile of mixed debris. In terms of volume of what we're coming into down at the lot, there is a certain portion to which sending things through that log chopper or turning it into biochar or setting it aside because it's a little funky piece, it does have its limits. You do have to, at moments, take yourself back and say, okay, some of this does need to become something else. It doesn't exactly destroy the value of it, but I'm personally not a fan of just chipping wood. We have plenty of wood chips in the industry just by arborists alone, because that's their primary way of actually getting rid of wood waste. And same with, I'll reference, like, it's actually Rhode Island Resource Recovery, but it's known as the Johnston landfill. They take in wood waste, but 100% of that wood waste turns to chip. They do a small bit of composting, but they just chip it down. And it's just to reduce volume, and it's to reduce complexity. So it's basically a saturated market, and it doesn't exactly bring out the most value that it could be. But at a certain point, there is a means to an end here. And when you're looking at mountains of mixed waste, especially that have been on that site since day one, you do somewhat, unfortunately, have to process it in that way. So this is us actually screening our compost that was inoculated with biochar. So just a vibratory screener to get out a certain size of material. And so that compost was made from Brown University's leaves that were donated, not this season, but the season before. They were dispersed to the public through Stuart Martin, who's evangelical, what does he say?
Yes,
yeah, evangelistic, a madman of compost, very passionate. So we worked with him to get our leaf waste, which was excess, which didn't get turned around, put the biochar in it, turned it over, and then we ended up cutting this with our own mix of loam and then sold through our own jobs actually as a soil amended. Oh yeah. Oh, boy. Poor dog. But some of those images were AI though. Anything with a hard hat and a cigarette was AI. The dog. I didn't light him up. So part of my contract in the city is for educational purposes and professional development. And as I said at the beginning, I had no idea, okay, what the hell am I do with that? I know how to process wood. And that was a nightmare enough because it was at scale. I had been doing it in my own practice, which is accepting as many logs as I felt comfortable with. Then it was like, hey, you're going to take the tens of thousands of city trees here that we need to process. You're going to take all of that. It was great. So that was the easy part. The educational part, I was like, what? Okay, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, but this fell into my lap. Right here, I was approached by the Providence Fire Department. They actually needed to do chainsaw training. And I was like, oh, that's perfect. And again, I had to ask the city, I had to bounce it off the higher ups. Like, is it okay to like have the fire department on site and I'll tell them how to use a chainsaw? I'm like, absolutely, like we love it. And so this is great because they need to know how to handle storm debris in terms of emergencies. And it's one of those things like, where do you get wood? Like, where do you go and practice this? Because you're not going to go out in the field and start chopping trees. And so it actually ended up being beautiful. The whole month of September, we ended up doing this with them and showing them basic felling techniques, basic or common scenarios where trees get snagged. Went over a couple other details, but that was fantastic. That landed so well. And then this is actually RISD, Landscape Architecture. We did that last fall, and that was a great on-site tour, which if we could ever do that again, definitely pull through, because it's awesome to see all of this at scale and in person, and it's easier to convey like the scope that we're working with. But that was another portion, outside another tour we did outside of that, but it started to fulfill that professional development and educational component. And so now it's filling itself in, and there's much more demand for that type of interaction. And we have a couple of other ideas floating around. And I've just given them, who knows, making up lies. They were listening. Now, this is stretching it a little bit more, but this is something I've been developing behind the scenes as of late, which is like an app, where it became necessary because the pen and paper has its limits when you're dealing with a high degree of complexity, because especially if we're open to the public on Saturdays, we're open like 9 to 5, people come in looking for biochar, looking for firewood, looking for logs, looking for milling, and it's like, oh, look, that's a whole niche, each one of those things that you need to know all this information, all your price points, all your logistics, and it got too much. So I was like, okay, I gotta become a coder, I gotta become a programmer, figure out an app. And so this is be the first season I'm gonna be running this. I did a little prototype at the tail end of last season, but started dialing this in, oh yeah, I'll show you a second, with more species-specific, current market prices, things that, unless you had it stored in your head, it's much easier just to bring this up right on a list, go right off that. And so this is something that's going to very much streamline the woodlots, hopefully, coming this season, and help expand that, even though it's not so tangible as the tooling that we're using to physically move these objects, but it's just as important, arguably more important than actually processing it out. So that's the first part of the speech there. I know we're cooked on time. We can open a Q&A for that? Yeah? Okay.
Questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
I imagine this is a question that others might have in the room, so I'll speak it into being. Say I'm a RISD student and I do not have access to an excavator, and I do not have access to a lot of specialized tooling, but I'm interested in working with reclaimed wood, right? I'm interested in sustainability, and I don't just want to go to the store and buy something that's being exclusively milled and chopped down for that purpose. Where do I start? How do I start looking into these options? I mean, obviously here in Providence we have the wood lot,
Yes.
but you mentioned like, you can reach out to a sawyer and connect with them if you have a piece of lumber that you already want to chop down. But yeah, like where do we start?
In Providence specifically, definitely
Yes.
in Woodlawn.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the whole manifestation of its existence. But I started there in the same exact position. Mine started because as my practice post-graduation was forming, I leaned heavily on my carpentry skill set and design skill set out of ID. And that's because the tooling is generally affordable. Like you can basically afford a saw, like a hand saw and an axe. Like if you want to hew your own lumber, meaning take an axe and dimension it manually, you literally can do that. It doesn't take a lot of sophisticated tooling to be able to dimension pieces or sculpt pieces. But outside of that, I was, beg, borrow, steal. Just make calls to arborists. What do you have for logs? Could you drop some off? I even went as far when we would be walking through one of the parks in Cumberland. It was by some power lines. So utility companies have to maintain like safety perimeters. And there was a massive red oak burl at the base of one of the trees they took. And I was calling town hall, I'm like, can I go in the woods and just like grab that burl? And they're like, absolutely not. Like, okay, so we went at night. And I was like, and I walked by it every day and it was like notched out of the tree. So it's one of those things, like you could totally do it. If you really want to, you can figure out your way. But luckily enough, at least in our environment, and I'm not trying to like sell myself here on it, but like that's really why the woodlot exists, is for that exact need. Sure.
2 questions. Do you, this might be overkill, but do you save any of that sawdust when you use this larger saw? Because I saw that there was like a ton piling up.
Oh my God, a ton.
Or is
Yes, I mean, we're not short on carbon, right, in all forms. So we get like the actual shavings off of the chainsaws. Think of the chainsaws, because I know this from people who do smoking wood, even for like restaurants, like generally fruit trees, but it can be oaks for like brisket and stuff like that. You have to be careful with using bar and chain oil. Even though it's biodegradable, I don't think it's like friendly to eat and those kinds of things. So you can actually use canola oil to cut as a lubricant. But in terms of like saving it and setting aside for a carbon source for like compost, it's much better to go off another means. So either our bandsaw mill, which doesn't require like lubrication, and you get a finer powder, or that tub grinder. After we actually shred our wood, you can go and screen it and actually separate the shredded wood from the fines, and the fines being like particulates. And that's a much better carbon-based source for whatever you want shavings for. But you could use bedding off of a chainsaw, but there is oil in there for sure. And there's
I feel like
probably
students
some
are
metal.
like a biomaterial
Yeah.
ingredient.
I know that there are a lot of like composite.
Yeah.
Also, hi everybody, I work at the Nature Lab. There are a lot of people using like, sawdust and other sort of like small, we actually had a teaching fellow in landscape architecture was using like leftover wood ash from the wood shop
Oh, really?
and was like incorporating them into these like glass recipes.
Well, it's in like a bioconcrete recipe too, I think.
Yes.
Like the ash. So
Yeah.
that was one. And then speaking of concrete, when you were laying down those wooden tiles,
Oh, yeah.
did you just use concrete as your filler in between, or like what
No, so that's a stone base. I mean, there'd be a bunch of different applications, but generally because it's permeable, you need water to keep flowing through. So we use a 3/4 crushed stone, which is just aggregate, and then I think we did 3/8 stone on top of that, and then you just went right to that. And then the joint filler is a polymetric sand, which is like technically a bit of an adhesive when it's masonry, like when you're actually using pavers or bricks. So it doesn't quite stick to the wood, but the specific blend was permeable. And because you can do permeable pavers as well and permeable brick, we just use that. But I don't really like that product. I think stone dust, even though it's less permanent, it's considered permeable. It would be a better application for actual wood, because the polymetric sand is expensive, and at the end of its life cycle, it's just going to get tossed.
Yeah.
There's no salvaging that. Stone dust is, just leave it, it's fine. Yeah. But yeah, no concrete.
Cool.
Does anybody want to see a sample? I brought tooling in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we invite everyone up here?
Yeah, please come up. Yeah, don't be shy.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need some of
Yeah.
You also say you can see like immediately what I don't know, what people would do or how it would fail. Did anything happen that you didn't want to happen? saying,